I have examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue d'Essai. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I know as the Rue d'Essai. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I have heard the music of Erich Zann. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Carr-Quest of H.P. Lovecraft. I am your host, Andrew Carr, and welcome once more to another podcast-style episode of this show. And today we're going to be covering the music of Erich Zann. Now, this story is going to be interesting because while I usually do the podcast episodes when footage messes up or something like that, I just a little behind the scenes fact for you there. This episode's going to be a little bit different. The audio did kind of mess up, but I also feel like in the original video I didn't go into as much detail as I could have with the story. I feel like there was a lot more angles I could have explored, and I feel like through this format I could probably do those things. So, let's do that. So this story, the music of Erich Zann, follows the main character who has moved into this house. I'm guessing it's kind of like a boarding house from it's on this street called the Rue d'Essai, as I mentioned earlier, and one night he hears these strange melodies coming from up above his room, and he soon comes to find that the person who made those melodies is this musician dude named Erich Zann. And the more he finds out about Mr. Zann, the more he realizes that there is something more to this man than he may have expected. So this story is, it's still fresh in my mind because I read it yesterday, and when I was originally going to record it so that I could get it out earlier than usual, but, life happens and stuff. So it's still fresh in my mind, and I have to say, this is one of my new favorite Lovecraft stories. And I know that it's kind of early to say that, but it's true. I think this is one of Lovecraft's absolute best, and I will get into why. So, from what I remember, that there was a lot. There's a lot of really good suspense, and I think that's one of the reasons as to why I like it so much. It's perfectly well paced. It sets up the mystery of the Rue d'Essai and who Erich Zann is, and I think it builds and builds and builds until the final sort of climactic playoff, as it were, between some sort of mysterious entity. We'll get there, but yeah, I really like the character of Erich Zann. I think he's a good enigmatic figure. I think he's also just a really interesting character because it's kind of Lovecraft writes it to where it's kind of like the more he writes about it, the less you know. And I know that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but I mean it's oh, he's a musician, and but Lovecraft doesn't really describe the music, because you can't really describe the music in text form, can you? But, other than how it sounds, but you can't really, describe how it's played or anything like that, or the actual, melody or anything. And at a certain point, the main character, approaches Erich Zann, I think, the first time he meets him in the room, and he says, hey man, I heard this music upstairs, and I wondered if you could play it again. And he starts whistling it to him, but he freaks out and he's like, another element of the story is that Zann, the story was written at a time when it was okay to describe someone as, I'm not sure if I can say it. The implication is that he is basically, Lovecraft, I think, implies that Erich Zann is deaf or something, because he writes later, I think, like before the climax, he says that he makes a screech. Erich made a screech that only a mute could make, and I was kind of like, is that kind of implying that he's deaf or something like that? But anyway, I think one of the best elements of this story is the final climactic showdown, because it's not how Lovecraft typically does a showdown. Lovecraft doesn't really do climaxes like you think they do. He usually just kind of like, stuff build up, and then it just kind of is like, and then it kind of just ends, sort of open-endedly. And this one definitely does too. But one of the interesting things that I learned about this story before reading it was that Lovecraft actually said that this was one of his favorite stories that he wrote, because something about, like, it lacked the, like, the over-explicitness of, like, his other work. I'm not sure if I'd really go that. I'm not sure if I'd say that, but I will say I do agree with the man. It's one of the few times I actually agree with the man on something. But this is definitely one of his best stories, as I've mentioned already. And I think another reason that I really like this story is I like it because it sort of ties back to my own personal love of classical music. Because ever since that fateful day at an elementary school, when I got into the car when Mom was picking me up, and she was playing Mozart in the car, she got a Mozart CD, and I was like, "Oh, like, what is this?" And she was like, "Oh, it's Mozart." And from then on, I just loved classical music. I still love it to this day, and I feel like this story really tied into that, especially the ending. I keep coming back to the ending, but something that Lovecraft mentions is that up until this point, Erich Zann has mostly played like these odd sort of melodies. He's played sort of these creepy, weird kind of pieces, and then during this last bit, he writes that this is the only time, like, from the narrator's perspective, the narrator's kind of like, oh, this is the first time I realized that Erich Zann was playing a piece from a different composer. This was the first time he'd ever heard, a different composer. His music come from Erich Zann's viol, which, by the way, you'll see if you look up online a lot of analysis, well, a lot of, like, not analysis, but like a lot of, like, pictures depicting Erich Zann playing his music. They portray him using, like, a fiddle or, like, a violin. I think a lot of people, like, they read, like, viol, like VIOL, and they go, oh, it's shorthand for violin. I looked it up. No, a viol is a completely different instrument. It's played kind of like a cello, but it's also not a cello, which is, I'm not especially well versed in the realm of music or musical instruments, but yeah, I'd never actually heard of a viol before, or at least like this specific viol. I've heard of a violin, but I've never heard of a viol. So hey, thanks Lovecraft for introducing me to another musical instrument that I'd never heard of before. But specifically, the piece that he notes that Zann is playing at the end, he describes as something like a wild Hungarian dance, popular in the theater. And my mind, while reading that bit, or reading along to the Horror Babble audio version of it, the music that entered my mind at that moment was Johann Brahms' Hungarian Dance Number 5. And I think because I can imagine with how, Zann is just wildly playing this viol before the window behind which there's some sort of force. He's like playing it wildly. And I can imagine Zann playing that song because it's a very sort of, if you hear it, it's kind of like a very sort of chaotic song. It's kind of like do 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 do. It's kind of like that. So I can imagine him going like do 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 do, and like playing it just rapidly, and how it's described. And I think it actually helped build the suspense in the scene a lot more. So yeah, another kind of question that I think that was brought up in other sort of articles talking about this was, was the Rue de Say, the street that the character moved in on, real? Like what was it real? Was it like a figment of his sort of imagination? It kind of leads to again like the whole Lovecraft madness, insanity kind of themes. Another question I saw, I think that it's posed by a few other Lovecraft fans regarding the story is like, what was that force that Erich Zann was playing to? Like what? Because like the apartment that he is moved in on at this part of and in this house. Again, I'm so sorry, I'm jumbling my words today, but like the window in the room, in Erich's room, it's established earlier, if you open it, you'll see just a grand view of like this like city, and I think it's implied to be somewhere in France. Although I learned later that Auseil, I think it's spelled like, in the story it's spelled like Auseil, isn't actually a French word. I don't know. Maybe Lovecraft thought it sounded French, But when the main character opens it up later during the climax of the story, he opens it, but it's just pitch blackness. It's just darkness with like the lights of the city still going, and there's a lot of I'm not sure if there's necessarily a lot of speculation, but I would argue that there is. If one were to read it, they would probably go, well, what's that all about? I saw something that's. Again, I'm getting so off track. I'm so sorry. But yeah, I think to sort of wind it up a little bit here, I feel like I've gone on quite a few tangents, and again, I'm so sorry. I'm really kind of rushing this video because it didn't really come out the way I wanted it. So again, I'm so sorry. But yeah, so this is a pretty good story. I like it a lot. It's one of my new favorite Lovecraft tales, and I recommend it wholeheartedly. I think this is, if I were to put it up on the tier list, I would probably put it in top of it. Well, not top of A, but I definitely put it somewhere in S. Don't know why I said A at first. I put it top of S. But yeah. So as a for Lovecraft connections, I couldn't really find none that were specifically stated. Once again, thank you all for coming to check out this episode, for watching this episode, sorry. I have been your host, Andrew Carr. This has been the Carr-Quest of H.P. Lovecraft, and the next episode I'm really excited for, because the next episode is one of Lovecraft's biggest stories. Next week, we'll be going over The Call of Cthulhu. But until then, folks, this has been Andrew Carr, and I'll see y'all later next week with the next episode. Remember, people, Call of Cthulhu next week. See ya.